When he was alive, the house breathed. It had a heartbeat, laughter echoing in the kitchen, the quiet hum of shared prayer at dusk, the soft rhythm of two voices learning to live in harmony. But now, that heartbeat was gone. The rooms stood still. The clock ticked too loudly. Every sound, the creak of the floor, the closing of a door, even the kettle whistling, reminded her of what was missing. She tried to keep things as they were, his cup on the table, his slippers under the bed, as if leaving them untouched could somehow bring him back. But absence has a way of filling space. It seeps into corners, wraps itself around the furniture, and whispers in the quiet. And though she didn't say it aloud, the thought haunted her every evening. This house feels too big for one heart. Daylight had mercy. In the morning, there were tasks to do, things to wash, floors to sweep, meals to prepare. As long as the sun stayed, she could keep pretending she was all right. But when evening came, and the light began to fade through the curtains, her hands would tremble. She would linger by the window, watching the sky turn from gold to grey, and feel her chest tighten. It wasn't just fear of the dark, it was fear of what the dark brought. Memories, longing, silence. She would light a small lamp early, as if its flicker could hold back the sorrow waiting in the corners. But lamps only light rooms. They can't warm hearts. And every night, as shadows deepened, she whispered the same silent plea, "Don't let this night be so long, Lord." But the nights were always long. At first she tried to hold the tears back. She told herself to be strong, to have faith, to remember that God was still good. But faith doesn't silence grief, and grief doesn't ask for permission. So she wept. Every night, after the lights went out, the sobs came quietly at first, then deeper, until her pillow was damp and her throat ached from whispering his name. Sometimes she tried to pray through the tears, but words blurred into sobs, and the only sound left was pain. Her body would eventually surrender, tired, trembling, falling asleep, not in peace, but in exhaustion. And yet each morning she woke again, alive, still crying, still waiting. The tears seemed endless, but what she didn't yet know was that each one was being counted in heaven. It wasn't the darkness that frightened her. It was the silence inside it. There were moments, deep in the night, when even her heartbeat sounded too loud, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every breath, every thought, every ache that refuses to fade. She would sit on the edge of the bed, the small lamp off, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring into the dark that seemed endless. Sometimes she imagined she heard him, his footsteps, his cough, the way he'd say her name before bed. But it was only memory, the mind trying to comfort itself with ghosts. She whispered, "Lord, I can't do this anymore." No answer came, only stillness, a stillness so deep it almost felt alive. But somewhere beyond that silence, in the unseen space between heaven and her breaking heart, someone was listening, waiting for the right moment to speak. That night was heavier than the rest. It wasn't just sadness, it was the weight of loneliness itself, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She lay there, tears soaking into her pillow, and something inside her broke open. All the prayers she had held back, the polite ones, the rehearsed ones, fell away. What escaped her lips was raw, trembling, desperate. "Jesus, are you here?" It wasn't accusation, it was longing, the cry of someone who had waited too long in the dark. Her voice cracked, her hands clenched. She waited, but there was no reply. Only her breathing, the sound of her own sobs fading into silence. Yet, in that silence, heaven had heard the invitation, the kind of cry that never goes unnoticed by Jesus, because his light always begins where human strength ends. Minutes passed, then an hour, then another. Her tears slowed, but the emptiness did not. The darkness around her seemed thicker, pressing close, as if the night itself was listening. She turned her face toward the ceiling and whispered, "Even you are quiet, Lord." There was no movement, no flicker of light, no voice, just the sound of her breath, uneven, tired, human. She had heard stories of miracles, of people who felt angels near, of warmth in prayer and divine voices in the night. But for her, there was nothing, and yet that nothing was not empty. It was the holy pause, the stillness before the dawn, the silence before the first word of comfort is spoken. Jesus was there. He had always been there. She just didn't know that light often arrives quietly when the soul is too weary to expect it. It was almost morning when her eyes closed again. She was too tired to cry anymore, but one last tear escaped. Slow, unforced, pure. It fell across her cheek, caught the faint glow of moonlight and disappeared into her pillow. But in heaven, it was seen, because every tear, especially the ones shed in solitude, is noticed, remembered, and received. That single tear was enough to call the Comforter nearer, enough to break the silence that had bound her heart. As she drifted into restless sleep, the air in the room changed. It was almost imperceptible, a stillness but warmer, as if someone had stepped inside the dark and brought peace with them. She didn't wake, but her breathing eased, and for the first time in weeks her soul began to rest. Heaven had begun to move. Just before dawn she stirred. Her body was still heavy with sleep, but her spirit sensed something new. The room wasn't brighter, not yet, but the darkness felt thinner, gentler. She opened her eyes slowly. There was no light source. The lamp was off, the curtains still drawn, and yet something glowed, not around her, but within her. It felt like warmth beneath her ribs, like a candle had been lit in the very center of her chest. She sat up, pressing a hand over her heart. The light didn't burn. It comforted. It didn't dazzle. It stayed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she whispered into the air, "Is that you?" A peace settled in the room, wordless, deep, complete. It was answer enough. The light didn't come from the window or from any lamp. It was something deeper, soft, steady, and alive. She sat very still, afraid that moving might make it vanish, but it didn't. It grew, slowly, gently, like the first light of morning seeping into a long night. Her hands rested on her lap, trembling slightly. She wasn't imagining this. She knew what she felt. The air had changed. It was no longer heavy. It was holy, and though her eyes saw only the familiar shapes of her room, the small table, the faded curtains, the chair by the window, everything felt different. It was as if the darkness had forgotten how to be cruel. It had been softened by the light of someone greater, and she felt it then, deep in her heart, the unmistakable sense that she was no longer alone. Her lips trembled. "Jesus," she whispered, the name more breath than sound, and the warmth deepened, as if the very walls had answered, "Yes, it's me." She didn't see him, but she didn't need to. His presence was everywhere, in the quiet, in the warmth, in the stillness that carried peace instead of pain. Then came the voice, not through her ears, but through her soul, soft, gentle, so full of love it made her cry again, but this time, not from grief. "You're not alone in this night." The words sank deep, not just into her mind, but into the very places where sorrow had built walls. She covered her face with both hands, as if to hide the tears, but Jesus' voice came again, a whisper that felt like light, wrapping itself around her heart. "I was here in every tear you cried. Every night you thought I was gone, I was beside you." She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her breath shook, and the only response her soul could manage was worship. In that dark room, the light of heaven finally had a home. The light wasn't just inside her anymore. It seemed to flow outward, touching everything it reached. The bed, the walls, the small cross hanging by her window. The whole room shimmered, not with brightness, but with peace. She looked around through tear-blurred eyes, and it felt like the air itself had come alive, breathing softly, carrying warmth, filling every corner that once held fear. There were no shadows left, not because light had chased them away, but because they had been transformed. Every space that had once felt empty now whispered, "You are loved." And in that moment, She understood something sacred. Jesus doesn't always take away the night, and sometimes he just fills it with his light. She still wept. But the tears were different now. They fell freely, gently, without bitterness. She no longer cried because she was alone. She cried because she wasn't. Each tear felt like release, the letting go of years of silent pain, the surrender of wounds she had tried too long to hide. And through the tears, she felt his presence steady beside her, invisible but unshakable. There was no more fear of the dark, no more dread of the silence, because now the silence itself spoke. The dark glowed softly. She had not only been comforted, she had been found, and the peace that settled over her heart that night didn't leave with the sunrise. It stayed, like light that had chosen her as its dwelling place. The next morning arrived quietly. Sunlight touched the curtains as it always did, but this time the light looked alive. She sat up slowly, blinking at the gentle glow spreading through her room. Nothing had changed. The same furniture, the same faded wallpaper, and yet everything had changed. The weight she used to wake up with was gone. The heaviness in her chest had been replaced by something softer, a still joy, calm and pure. She whispered, "Good morning, Lord." Her voice trembled, not from sadness, but from awe, as if she was speaking to a friend she could finally see with her heart. The night hadn't disappeared, it had simply been redeemed, and the light of morning, that soft, golden grace, seemed to tell her, "You made it through." For the first time in months, she believed that the new day was not a burden, but a gift. She hadn't risen from bed this easily in a long time. There was still pain in her knees, a little stiffness in her back, but her soul moved freely now, and the body followed. She walked toward the window, pushed the curtains wide open, and let the sunlight flood in. Her heart didn't flinch at the brightness. It welcomed it. There had been a time when morning light felt cruel, a reminder of all she'd lost, but today it felt like promise. She whispered, "I'm still here," and somewhere deep inside she heard his quiet reply, "Yes, and so am I." The two simple truths, "I'm here and he's here," became her strength, her reason to rise, her proof that even after the longest night, life begins again. In the days that followed, people noticed something about her. It wasn't her words. She didn't speak much about what had happened. It wasn't her face, though there was a softness there now, a quiet joy that hadn't been there before. It was the light, not visible, but unmistakable, the kind that follows those who have walked through darkness and found God waiting in it. When she greeted the neighbor, her smile lingered. When she prayed for others, her voice trembled with tenderness. It was as if she had become a lantern, not shining for attention, but glowing because she'd been touched by light itself. And though she never said it aloud, her heart repeated it constantly. "I am no longer alone in the dark." And anyone who came near her felt that truth, like warmth spreading from her hands into theirs. It began quietly. A widow from church would visit, a neighbor who'd lost her husband would stop by for tea. They didn't come for advice. They came for her presence. There was something healing about her stillness, something safe in her silence. She didn't speak long prayers or recite verses. She simply listened. She let others cry without rushing to stop their tears. And in that gentle companionship, they found comfort, the same kind that had once found her. She never claimed to be strong. She just knew the source of all strength. And those who left her little house always said the same thing, "I feel lighter." She smiled every time she heard it because she knew what they couldn't yet see. It wasn't her light they felt, it was his. The same Jesus who had met her in the dark was now using her to shine in others' nights. One afternoon, she found herself sitting with his old photo album again. It had always been too painful to open, a collection of moments that reminded her of what she'd lost. But this time, she turned each page without fear. The laughter frozen in the pictures didn't sting anymore. The images of their hands clasped together didn't break her heart. They blessed it. Every memory, once sharp with sorrow, now shimmered with gratitude. She touched one photo gently. his familiar smile looking back at her, and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, that I got to love him." That single sentence changed everything. Her loss was no longer a wound. It had become a testimony, proof that love had been real and that God had been present through it all. In the quiet that followed, she felt his absence not as emptiness, but as sacred space, a place Jesus himself now filled with peace. As months passed, she realized something astonishing. She no longer feared the night. When the sun went down, she would light her small lamp, not to chase the dark away, but to welcome it. The same room that once suffocated her had become her sanctuary. The same silence that once wounded her now cradled her prayers. Every evening, she would sit in her chair by the window, watching shadows stretch across the walls and whisper, "Jesus, you're still here." And always the peace would return, the same warmth, the same presence. She had learned something few ever understand, that darkness is not the absence of God, but often the place where his light shines most clearly. And so, when night came, she no longer wept. She rested, knowing the dark itself had become holy ground. It happened gently, as everything in her life now did. Her hands, once busy with prayer and kindness, grew still. Her breathing slowed, her eyes half closed as twilight settled softly through the window. The neighbor who checked on her every evening found her there, peaceful, serene, the small lamp still glowing beside her. But the strangest thing was the room. It was radiant, not bright, but warm, alive. The woman felt it instantly. Something divine had passed through this place, and as she touched the widow's hand, she understood. This was not the end of light, but its fulfillment. Her night had come, but the darkness never did. Only the presence remained. It was said that her face looked peaceful, a faint smile, eyes closed as if she'd just drifted into sleep. But in truth, she had awakened. For when her last breath left her body, she opened her eyes in a place she had longed for all her life. And there he was, the same Jesus who had sat beside her in every night of sorrow, now radiant in light that no darkness could ever touch. Her tears were gone, her loneliness gone, her pain gone. He took her hand, the same one that once trembled in the dark, and whispered, "You cried in the night, but see, beloved, it was only the road to morning." And as the light of heaven surrounded her, she finally understood. Every tear had been a seed of dawn. Every night had been leading here. Her soul, now whole, rested in eternal morning.